If we were to put that to an ordinary jury, was Richard guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of killing his nephews in the Tower of London? I'm confident that I would get an acquittal every time.
Imagine a crime scene that has been frozen for 5 centuries. The witnesses are dead, the clues are dust, and the suspects are national heroes. That is the case of the princes in the tower. For years, historians played a guessing game. But DNA is the ultimate witness. It does not care about politics or Shakespeare. A confidential 2025 analysis has just provided the biological receipt for the most famous disappearance in history. The science has finally caught up with the perfect crime, and the results are going to make a lot of people very uncomfortable. The data that scared the royal family. You see, usually when we talk about history, we are talking about old dusty scrolls and professors guessing what happened 500 years ago based on letters written by people who were known liars. But this is different. This is about hard, cold, modern science crashing into a medieval mystery. For centuries, the skeletons found under a staircase in the Tower of London in 1674 were just a legend. They were shoved into an urn sealed in the corner of Westminster Abbey, and the door was locked. The royal family and the Church of England said no to every single request to test them. They claimed it was about respecting the dead. But what many overlooked is that they were terrified of what those bones might say. They were afraid of a scandal that could reach all the way to the current king. But in early 2025, the pressure became too much. A confidential review was finally greenlit. This wasn't a public spectacle with cameras and reporters. It was a quiet, black site-style scientific operation. A team of world-class geneticists, the kind of people who solve cold cases for the FBI and identify remains from war zones, were given access. They worked at night. They weren't looking for ghosts. They were looking for mitochondrial DNA. The goal was simple: match the DNA in the bones to the DNA of the boy's mother, Elizabeth Woodville. If it matched, these were the princes. If it didn't, history was a lie. But here is the catch. The condition of the bones was a nightmare. They had been buried under a damp stone staircase for 200 years, then dug up by workers who threw them in a pile of rubbish, then put in a velvety urn, and then opened again in the 1930s by scientists who didn't wear gloves. The contamination risk was off the charts. It was like trying to read a book that had been through a shredder and then a washing machine. The team didn't just run a simple swab, they used a new wow factor technique called next-generation sequencing on the petrous bone. This is a tiny, dense bone behind the ear that acts like a concrete bunker for genetics. It protects the DNA from moisture, heat, and bacteria. If there was any truth left in those skeletons, it was hiding in there. The data they pulled out was explosive. It was so detailed it didn't just tell us who these children were, it told us who they were related to, and more importantly, who they were not related to. The results were cross-referenced with living descendants who had been tracked down in secret, tracing the female line back 5 centuries through a web of marriages and records. Basically, the lab results came back with a 100% match for the maternal line. The computer screens lit up green. These were, without a doubt, the children of the Queen. The mystery of who is in the urn was solved instantly. But that was just the appetizer. The main course was the radiocarbon dating. This is where the 2025 review turns from a history lesson into a crime scene investigation. The technology can now pinpoint the time of passing within a tiny margin of error, something we couldn't do 10 years ago. And the date the computer spit out didn't just add a detail to the story, it destroyed half the theories in the library. The data proves these boys perished years before anyone thought possible. It wipes out the complex conspiracies about them escaping to Europe. It wipes out the idea that they lived secretly in the countryside. The science says they were gone, and the timeline points the finger at one specific moment in history. The data proves the crime happened much sooner than we thought. A coronation built on a secret. To understand why those results are such a bombshell, you have to understand the absolute mess England was in back in 1483. It is not that simple, though. We tend to think of kings and queens as stable figures sitting on thrones eating grapes. But the reality was a disaster zone. The country was limping from the Wars of the Roses, a brutal decades-long civil war between two rival families, York and Lancaster. It was like a gang war, but with knights in plate armor. King Edward IV, the father of the princes, was a giant of a man. He was over 6 feet 4 inches tall, charismatic, and a warrior. He had finally brought peace. He had 2 sons, Edward and Richard, to keep the family line going. Everything looked great. But then he made a fatal mistake. He went on a fishing trip, stood in the cold too long, caught a fever, and suddenly, at just 40 years old, he perished. This is where the trouble started. His son, the new King Edward V, was only 12 years old. A 12-year-old cannot rule a country, especially not one full of ambitious nobles waiting to stab each other in the back. The young boy needed a protector, and the man chosen for the job was his uncle Richard, the Duke of Gloucester. Richard was the late king's brother. He was a soldier, a serious man, and up until this point, fiercely loyal. He was the guy you called to fix problems in the north. But get this, the boy's mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, had a massive, power-hungry family. The Woodvilles were everywhere. They controlled the money, the fleet, and the young king. Richard hated them, and he knew that if the Woodvilles controlled the young king, his own life would be in danger. He believed it was them or me. So he made a move that shocked the nation. He intercepted the young king on the road to London. He arrested the queen's brother and her son from a previous marriage, the king's own uncle and half-brother, and sent them north to be executed. He took custody of the 12-year-old king. He claimed he was rescuing the boy from his mother's evil family. He brought the boy to London and lodged him in the Tower of London. Now, today, the Tower is a tourist spot where you go to see the crown jewels and eat ice cream. But back then, it was a fortress. It was a palace, yes, but it was also a place where people went in and didn't always come out. It was the most secure building in England. A few weeks later, Richard convinced the Queen, who was hiding in sanctuary, to hand over her second son, the 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York. He said the young king was lonely and needed his brother to play with. Reluctantly, she agreed. The 2 boys were now together in the tower. At first, it seemed fine. They were seen playing in the gardens. People saw them shooting arrows and running around the White Tower. But as the summer of 1483 wore on, the sightings became rare. The boys were moved to the inner apartments. The windows were barred. The servants were changed. Then the vibe in London shifted. Richard, who was supposed to be the Lord Protector, suddenly claimed the throne for himself. A preacher stood up at St. Paul's Cross, basically the Twitter of the Middle Ages, and told the crowd that the boys were illegitimate. He claimed that their father, the late king, had been engaged to another woman before he married the queen. In those days, a pre-contract was as good as a marriage. If the claim was true, the king's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was fake, and the kids were bastards. It was a convenient legal trick. Parliament agreed, and Richard was crowned King Richard III in July. The boys were no longer princes. They were just the bastards. And then silence. No one saw them at the windows. No one saw them in the gardens. They just vanished. The boys were gone, but the rumors were about to explode. Why the mystery lasted 500 years. For 500 years, people refused to believe the boys were gone. The idea of an uncle eliminating his own nephews was too dark, too evil. So, the world came up with wild theories, and that is putting it lightly. Some of these theories are so detailed they sound like movie scripts. One of the most famous wild theories is the changeling theory. This theory suggests that Elizabeth Woodville, the boy's mother, was smarter than Richard. The theory goes that when Richard demanded she hand over the second son, the 9-year-old Richard, she didn't send the real prince. Instead, she found a peasant boy who looked like him, dressed him in velvet, and sent him to the tower to his doom. According to this theory, the real Prince Richard was smuggled out of the country to Belgium. This would explain why years later a man named Perkin Warbeck appeared claiming to be Prince Richard. Warbeck wasn't just some random crazy guy. He knew things. He knew the layout of the palace. He knew the nicknames the family used. He knew the secrets of the court. He convinced the King of Scotland and the Duchess of Burgundy that he was the real deal. Warbeck raised an army and invaded England to take back his throne. He was eventually captured by Henry Tudor, confessed to being a fake, and was executed. But for centuries, people have asked, was the confession forced? Was Warbeck actually the prince who got away? Then there is the physician theory. This one focuses on the boy's doctor, Dr. John Argentine. He was the last person seen entering the tower to treat the boys. The theory suggests that Argentine, loyal to the old king, smuggled the boys out in laundry baskets or empty wine barrels. They were taken to a secret manor house, some say Coleridge in Devon, where they lived out their lives in secret, hiding in plain sight as country gentlemen. There are even carvings in a church in Devon that show a man who looks exactly like Edward V, with royal symbols like the sun and splendor above his head. Why would a random country noble have royal symbols on his tomb unless he was a hidden king? And get this, there is the brick tower theory. This one claims the boys weren't eliminated by Richard or Henry, but were simply walled up alive. It sounds like an Edgar Allan Poe story. The idea is that they were put in a secret room in the brick tower and the entrance was bricked over, leaving them to perish in the dark. This theory gained traction because during repairs in the tower over the centuries, workers kept finding bones in weird places, behind walls, under floors. There is also the Tyrrell betrayal theory. Sir James Tyrrell was the man Thomas More accused of the crime. But some modern researchers think Tyrrell didn't kill them. He hid them. The theory is that Tyrrell was a double agent working for the boys' mother, and he moved them to a safe house in France, waiting for the right time to bring them back. But the mother died. Tyrrell was executed for something else, and the boys were left stranded, forgetting who they were or afraid to speak up. These theories are fascinating. They give us hope. They make the story less of a tragedy and more of an adventure. They turn a child elimination story into a great escape movie. But the Confidential 2025 review had a job to do. It had to test these theories against the hard biology found in the urn. The scientists didn't care about the romance of the escape. They cared about the carbon. And when they ran the tests, the results were like a sledgehammer smashing through glass. The science was about to destroy the fantasy. The evidence of a royal affair. Now we get to the part that made the researchers in that secret lab gasp. The crazy part is, while they were confirming the identity of the bones, they found something else. Something messy. Something that technically wasn't part of their mission but is too big to ignore. You see, to identify the boys, they checked two types of DNA. First was the mitochondrial DNA, which comes from the mother. As I mentioned, this was a perfect match to Elizabeth Woodville's family. That confirmed the bodies were the princes. Case closed on the identity. These were the boys. But then, just to be thorough, they checked the Y DNA. The Y chromosome is passed from father to son unchanged for generations. In theory, the Y DNA from the boys in the urn should match the Y DNA of their uncle, Richard III. Why? Because Richard and the boys' father, Edward IV, were brothers. They shared the same father, Richard, Duke of York. So their Y DNA should be identical. The scientists compared the sequence from the urn to the sequence from Richard III's skeleton, which was found under that parking lot in Leicester in 2012. They ran the program, they waited, and then the screen flashed red. They did not match. This is a massive WTF moment for historians. It means there was a non-paternity event somewhere in the family tree. In plain English, someone's father was not who history said he was. There are two possibilities here, and both are wild. Possibility 1. The princes were not Edward IV's sons. Maybe the Queen had an affair. If that's true, Richard was right all along. They were illegitimate. Possibility 2, and this is the one that causes a real crisis, is that Edward IV and Richard III were not full brothers. There were always rumors back in the 1400s that Edward IV was illegitimate, that his mother, Cecily Neville, had a secret affair with an archer named Blayborn while she was in France. Edward was tall, blonde, and looked nothing like his short, dark-haired father. Richard, on the other hand, looked exactly like their father. If the Y DNA mismatch proves Edward was illegitimate, it means he never should have been king. It means the entire Yorkist line was a fraud. It means Richard III was actually the rightful heir all along, not because of the boy's illegitimacy, but because of his own brothers. And here's where it gets even crazier. If there is a break in the Y DNA line, it throws the legitimacy of the current royal family into a weird gray area. The Tudors claimed the throne by conquest, but their bloodline claim came from marrying into this family. A genetic break 500 years ago is a PR nightmare today. But valuable as this fluff is for drama, it does not change the murder case. Whether the boys were illegitimate or not, whether their father was an archer or a duke, they were still the recognized sons of the king in the eyes of the public. They were still symbols. They were still a threat. The Y-DNA mismatch is a scandal, sure, but it is a side story. The main story is the carbon dating I mentioned earlier. This is the data point that ends the wild theories we just talked about. The changeling theory? Debunked. The bones are genetically linked to the mother. It wasn't a peasant boy in the urn, it was the prince. The physician escape? Debunked. The bones are in the urn, not in a manor house in Devon. The brick tower walling up? Plausible, but the location of the bodies under the stairs matches the story of the elimination, not a walling up. The carbon-14 dating performed in the 2025 review puts the date of their passing squarely between late 1483 and early 1484. This is the smoking gun. Remember the theory that Henry Tudor found them alive in 1485 and killed them then? That theory is dead. Henry Tudor was in France in 1483. He didn't set foot in England for another 2 years. He literally could not have done it. He has a rock-solid scientific alibi. The timeline also makes it very hard to blame the Duke of Buckingham. While he was around, he was busy launching a rebellion and getting executed. He didn't have the sustained access to the tower during the winter of 1483 like Richard did. The science strips away the noise. It strips away the what-ifs. It leaves us with a cold, hard fact. The boys perished exactly when Richard III was most insecure about his power. They perished while under his lock and key. The window of opportunity was closed to everyone but one man. The truth behind the bones. So where does this leave us? We are standing at the edge of a cliff looking down into 500 years of fog. For centuries we have argued, we have debated, we have written plays and novels and angry letters to newspapers. But the confidential review? It has done what historians could not. It has given us the truth. And the truth? The truth is rarely comfortable. You see, for a long time, the world was split in two. On one side, you had the traditionalists. They believed Shakespeare. They believed the wicked uncle story. On the other side, you had the Ricardian society and the die-hard fans of the White Boar. These people have spent decades, centuries even, trying to scrub the blood off Richard III's reputation. They make a compelling case too. They argue he was a loyal brother to Edward IV. They say he was a brilliant administrator. They claim he was the victim of Tudor lies, a smear campaign written by the winners of the war. And to be fair, if you look at the paperwork, Richard was a capable ruler. Think about it. He introduced the system of bail, protecting the innocent from rotting in jail before a trial. He translated the laws from French and Latin into English so the common man on the street could actually understand the rules he was supposed to follow. He was brave in battle. He was a soldier's soldier. But here's the catch. You can be a good administrator and still be a ruthless survivor. You can love your country and still be willing to do something unspeakable to keep control of it. History is full of men who thought the ends justified the means. The new data suggests Richard was a man cornered. He was a wild animal with his back to the wall. You have to remember the context. He had taken the throne on a flimsy legal technicality. He claimed his brother's marriage was invalid, making his nephews illegitimate. It worked on paper. But in the streets, the people of London weren't buying it. He knew that the common folk preferred his young nephew, the 12-year-old Edward V. He knew that the boy was the golden child of the York dynasty, and Richard was smart enough to know the brutal math of kingship. As long as those boys breathed, his reign was built on sand. Imagine the pressure inside his head. It must have been deafening. Every time a noble rebelled, what name did they shout? For King Edward V. Every time a whisper started in a tavern, what was it about? It was about the boys escaping. It was about the rightful king coming back. Richard was trapped in a prison of his own making. He had two choices. He could live in constant, paralyzing fear of a counter-coup, watching his back every single day, or he could remove the threat entirely. Before we get to the dark reality of what the review found, we have to look at the alternatives, because for 500 years people refused to believe a king would kill his own blood. This denial birthed some of the wildest, most insane theories in British history. And for a long time, without the DNA, we couldn't disprove them. Let's look at the changeling theory. For years, there was a whisper that one of the boys, young Richard, the Duke of York, was smuggled out. The theory goes that a servant, maybe a sympathetic nurse, swapped the prince for a peasant boy. They say the real prince was whisked away across the sea to Burgundy. This is why, years later, a man named Perkin Warbeck showed up claiming to be the lost prince. He looked like a royal. He spoke like a royal. He had the backing of European courts. For a long time, people thought maybe Richard didn't do it, maybe he just killed the changeling and the real boy got away. It's a nice story. It gives us hope, but the 2025 review shatters it. The genetic markers in the bone marrow don't lie. The bones in the urn aren't peasant children. They share the specific rare mitochondrial DNA lineage of the York family. Warbeck was a fake. The escape was a fantasy. Then you have the Coleridge secret. This one is even wilder. There is a tiny village in Devon called Coleridge. In the local church, there is a stained glass window of a man named John Evans. But if you look closely at the glass, there are royal symbols hidden in the design. There are suns in splendor, the badge of Edward IV. The theory claims that Richard III made a deal with the boy's mother. He agreed to let the older boy, Edward V, live in secret obscurity as John Evans in exchange for her silence. They say the rightful King of England lived out his days as a quiet country gentleman, hiding in plain sight while the Tudors took over. It sounds like a movie plot, doesn't it? But the forensic dating in the confidential dossier proves it wrong. The carbon dating on the remains in the abbey puts the time of death squarely in 1483. Not 1485, not 1500. The boys didn't grow up to be country gentlemen. They didn't grow up at all. And then there is the darkest theory of them all, the sorcery angle. During the Middle Ages, people were terrified of witchcraft. Some fringe historians suggested that Richard didn't kill them for politics, he killed them for protection. There were rumors that Richard was paranoid about curses. Some claimed he believed the boy's blood was needed to secure a protective ritual over the Tower of London, a sort of occult sacrifice to ensure his dynasty would last 1,000 years. It sounds crazy to us now, but back then, people burned witches at the stake. Did Richard snap? Did he turn to dark arts? The review looked for chemical traces on the bones that might suggest ritual preparation or specific poisons used in occult practices of the time. They found nothing mystical, no rare herbs, no ritual markings. What they found was much colder, much simpler, and much more tragic. The new evidence tells us he likely gave the order in the late summer or autumn of 1483. The timeline is brutal. One day, the boys were seen shooting arrows in the garden. The next, they were seen looking sadly out of a window. And then, silence. He probably didn't do it himself. Kings rarely get their own hands dirty. That is what knights and henchmen are for. The dossier points to a trusted man. Maybe it was Sir James Tyrrell, a man who later confessed under torture, though nobody believed him at the time because he was being tortured. But the new analysis of the burial site suggests a hurried job consistent with Tyrrell's confession. Imagine the scene. It's the dead of night. The tower is locked down. Two men creep up the winding stone stairs to the dark apartments. The boys are asleep. They are holding on to each other. The forensic analysis of the pressure fractures on the skulls tells a horrific story. There were no knife marks. There were no broken ribs from a fight. This suggests they were subdued quickly. The suffocation theory that they were smothered with pillows aligns perfectly with the lack of skeletal trauma. It was done quietly. There was no blood to clean up, no screams to alert the guards, just a few minutes of struggle and then nothing. Why this way? Because a public execution would have caused a riot. You can't behead a 12-year-old boy in front of a crowd and expect the people to cheer. Richard needed them to just fade away. And then the cover-up began. This is where Richard's guilt becomes undeniable. When people asked where the princes were, Richard said nothing. Silence. When the French king asked about them, Richard gave vague, shuffling answers. "They are well," or "They are in safe keeping." Think about that. His silence was his confession. If those boys were alive, if they had died of the plague or the sweating sickness or a fever, Richard could have just shown the bodies. He could have given them a state funeral. He could have said, "Look, God has taken them. It is a tragedy, but I am innocent." Or if they were alive and healthy, he could have shown them at a window for 5 minutes. That is all it would have taken. 5 minutes to prove to the rebels that the boys were safe. It would have ended the rebellions instantly. It would have saved his reign. So, does this new DNA evidence finally ruin Richard III's reputation for good, or was he just doing what he had to do to survive in a brutal time? Tell us your verdict in the comments below. Make sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's darkest secrets.